We're going to talk about phospholipids. This is one of the most important lipids in the biological systems. And here you can see two schematics. It's a space filling model. And here you can see a more detailed description of the phospholipids. Now let's going to try to identify three main components of the phospholipid that we just talked. So you can stop the video and try to identify three main things that you see of a phospholipid. The first thing that maybe you detect is this section that are fatty acids. And if you see these fatty acid here, saturated, this is saturated, and this example, the second fatty acid is unsaturated. So here in a phospholipid you have two fatty acids, not three, two fatty acids, and in some cases they can be saturated and in some cases they can be unsaturated. Here you can see the double bond. Now let's go to the second component. This is a glycerol molecule. Yeah, you can see 1, 2, the 3 carbon skeleton, the ester linkage that joins the glycerol plus the fatty acids. So here you can see a glycerol. And now the third component that we studied in a previous class. Do you remember what is the name of this functional group? It's a phosphate group. Very good. And a phosphate group here make this phospholipid have a very interesting property, a property that other lipids don't have. So remember that one of the unifying feature of lipids is that they are not soluble in water. So this part will be hydrophobic. They don't like, this part will not like water. However, the head of the phospholipid, the phosphate group, remember that it is very electronegative. And as is very electronegative, is going to be polar. So you will have a hydrophilic head. And that will be very important this will be very important for the cell membrane. And we will talk about that in a second. So let's recap all the things that I just said. And the first thing that I said in this slide, in the phospholipid, there are three main components. First component is there are two fatty acids. So here you can see the fatty acids. The second thing that you can have is a phosphate group. Here is your phosphate group. The third thing that I told you is that they are attached to a glycerol. And here is the glycerol. Okay, the second important thing that I told you that is very important for their function is that the fatty acids have a hydrophobic tail. So this part will be hydrophobic. So this is similar to all the other lipids. However, the third thing that I want that you remember is that the phosphate group, yes, this part, yeah, or this part is hydrophilic. So these give very interesting properties to the membranes. Let's talk about a potential application of the structure of the phospholipids that is very typical to be at the same time hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And one of the applications could be in the origin of life. I wonder you think how the first DNA molecule was created, how the first RNA molecule was created, how do you think that the cell membranes were created? And scientists have been doing for decades many experiments, and one very interesting is done with phospholipids. Yeah, phospholipid has this very interesting property that when you add it, you put phospholipids in water, they self-assemble. You don't need to organize it, they will reorganize themselves, forming these vesicles. And the vesicles, the hydrophilic will be in contact with water. So if you see here, you see all these heads, all the heads will be in contact with water. And now the hydrophobic will be the tails that it will be pointing pointing far from the water. And this is something that is very interesting because it's exactly the structure of a cell membrane. So we might not have to create these very interesting cell membranes, at least in the beginning. Could have been happened without the presence of any gene. It just happened randomly. And this allowed this amazing property that you can create an environment that something that is inside and something that is outside. So you can have chemical reactions here and chemical reaction here, but you can have a certain boundary that could have been very important for the to create the necessary chemical reaction for the origination of life. And when we went and studied cell membranes, we found that all cell membranes of all living organisms have phospholipids, and this is one of the major components. We will add, when we study more cell membranes, that cell membranes, in addition to phospholipids, also have proteins. But definitely all living organisms need phospholipids in the cell membranes. So let's summarize what we have just talked. First, I told you that when phospholipids are added to water, they self-assemble into a bilayer. The hydrophobic tails will be pointed into the interior, while the hydrophilic heads are pointing to the water. The second thing that I told you is that in living organisms, the phospholipids produce these cell membranes, these bilayers, and this is one of the major components of the cell membranes and are found in all living organisms. So this process, this simple experiment seems to have a very important implication and seems to be key to understand how cell membranes originate in our planet. Now we're going to talk about another type of lipid that are called asteroids. And here you can see the structure of an asteroid. If you remember the carbohydrates, we generally had a building block united by another building block, united by another building block. Lipids, as they are such a large and diverse group, they don't form polymers, so will be very different from phospholipid. But this group has something in particular, that they have 1, 2, 3, and 4 rings in the carbon skeleton. And this is a key feature. One example of an asteroid that is very well known is the cholesterol that is found in the cell membranes and allow the cell membranes to have more fluidity. So if you remember the cell membranes that have phospholipids, so let's draw 3 phospholipids. Imagine that you have 3 phospholipids. In between these phospholipids, you can have a cholesterol molecule that allows them to have more fluidity. So let's summarize. I told you 3 main things about asteroids that I hope that you remember. And the first thing that I told you is that asteroids are lipids. And the most interesting characteristic of this lipid is that they have 4 fused rings in the carbon skeleton. Also, the second thing that I told you is that asteroid that you have heard the most is the cholesterol and is found in the cell membrane of animals. And finally, and that although it's essential in animals, when at high levels, it can contribute to cardiovascular diseases. Okay, so I love to give you tables to summarize things because there is a lot of information, and I think this table is great. So here you can find the monomers of the components. Here you can find the polymers, and here you can have the type of linkage. So in the previous class, we talked about carbohydrate, and in the carbohydrate, the monomers are monosaccharides, and the polymer polysaccharide, and you have a type of linkage that is the glycosidic linkage. Then today we talk about lipids, and in lipids you have fatty acids you have as a component, and as a larger molecule you can have triglycerols, and you have ester linkage. And in the next two classes, we are going to talk about that in proteins, you will have amino acids. And when you unite a lot of amino acids, you will get polypeptids, and they are attached by peptide bonds. Finally, later we will talk about nucleotides, and the polymer of the nucleotides will be polynucleotides, and they are linked, and the type of linkage is phosphodiester linkage. So remember, this is a good way to summarize, and maybe you will have a class exercise that you have to fill these tables. So I hope that you enjoyed this class, and we talk later.